Welcome everyone to my talk today, the ultimate guide to Apex plugins. My name is Stefan Dobre. For those who don't know me, I am an Apex enthusiast. I work for AJAX, where I build plugins and browser extensions and tools and really do a lot of things around Apex, primarily plugins. So it's not only what I do at work, I also like to mess around with plugins in my free time, so it's also a hobby. So I'm really excited about this guide where I try to sum up all of my experiences and little tips and tricks and such things in one talk in 40 minutes. So let's do this. So on the agenda for today, we have a bit of theory. Unfortunately, we have to go through that. So we're going to be discussing the types of plugins, some benefits and drawbacks, some more meta stuff, but also where to find them, right? Because there's a bunch of them already out there in the wild, just ready for us to download them and import them. But also the anatomy of a plugin and how we go about building one. Then I'll be talking about the tools. Besides the Apex Builder, which other tools are there that help us with building plugins? And then if there's time left, which I hope there will be, I will be doing a quick live demo of taking some already existing implementation in Apex and packing it up nicely into a plugin. So the different types of plugins. What types of plugins are there? Also, just a quick note here that I think is very important to note. All of those different dynamic actions and items that we see inside of Apex itself, these are actually plugins. So the hide and show dynamic actions or the interactive grid, these are actually plugins. They are internal plugins, so we don't see the source code, but they are plugins. So anything that you see in those dynamic action select lists or regions or processes, we can build stuff like that as well. That's a very important point to make. So these 6 different types of plugins, and I've ordered them by popularity or from what you can see in the community that people are really building. So by far, dynamic actions and item type plugins are the most popular. Region types, there's some of them. Processes, not really, and I haven't seen yet an authorization or authentication plugin, at least in the open source community, but I know of organizations that do build them. So when we create a new plugin, we decide we have to pack this functionality into a plugin. Which type do we choose? Well, you would choose a dynamic action if your plugin would do something dynamically when triggered by some event, right? If you want to do something on click, or on page load or something like that, that would be considered a dynamic action. Examples of that are the common hide and show dynamic actions, right? Which are really just one line of JavaScript, but they are still nice native dynamic actions. You can have more complex dynamic actions such as the refresh action, which even does client-server communication, right? Because it has to fetch new, fresh data and replace it on the user screen. So dynamic actions are not just pure JavaScript, they can also communicate to the server, where you can execute PL SQL and send the result back. Item type plugins are usually things that can hold a value in session state. So think of a text field or a select list. The user picks something or types something in, and then when we submit the page, we can then use that value as a bind variable, right? And process it further. So if your thing needs to hold a value and pass it on to the server, that would probably be an item type plugin. In terms of regions, if you think a big visual component on the page, right, that would be a region. It can be boring, it can just be a bunch of HTML, so static content, or it can be maybe based on a query, so maybe a report, or you can go crazy and build something like the interactive grid. That is also a region type plugin. Then we have processes. The most common one that we use every day would be the execute PL SQL code, right? We use it on submit. After the user submits the page, we can execute some code. We put that code actually in a plugin, in a process type plugin. Another example could be send email, right? Or whatever we see in that drop-down list in Apex. Note that process type plugins are not only found in the processing tab, the third tab in the page designer. We can also invoke them before headers or after footer or in that side of the page as well. So our processes can also output HTML, but usually they're on the server side only where they do some processing. In terms of authorization and authentication plugins, they exist. They're not very popular. The documentation for them is kind of missing completely from what I can tell from the Apex APIs, but they are there, just not very popular. So we'll stick with the first few for the rest of this presentation. Why should we even bother with plugins though? What are the benefits really? And are there any drawbacks? Well, the benefits I would separate into two main categories. We want to bring in some new functionality that simply isn't there natively. So we could figure out how to build it ourselves, or we could download a plugin that already does that and it behaves like a native component. That is how we bring new functionality into Apex. Or perhaps we have this cluttered up page and lots of, let's say, a region and some imported files and some code on the page itself and dynamic actions all working together and building this component, whatever it might be. And we build it and it works. That's great. But what happens if we want to reproduce the same functionality on another page or in another app, or we want to ship it off somewhere else? It's very difficult to do. So when it comes to reusability and maintenance of our components or features or functionality, it is best to pack these up in a plugin. That way you have one instance of it, right? Which you then instantiate on the different pages or perhaps across different apps. So the benefit of that is that your page designer will stay pretty clean. You do not clutter it up with lots of components that are sometimes very difficult to debug for anyone who is not you. And also, yeah, it can be exported, imported very easily into other environments. And again, maintenance, very easy to just fix one thing as opposed to multiple things, right? You have one source of truth, which then gets propagated into its instances. So I will give you an example of that later, but it's very important to realize that we can modularize our components neatly with plugins. In terms of drawbacks, are there any? Are there any when building plugins? Kinda. So building a plugin is considerably more difficult than just throwing something on the page, putting your HTML somewhere and finding a place for your JavaScript. You really have to think about how you build it to make it generic enough so that everyone can use it in various instances. And also the build process is not trivial. So there will be a learning curve. Now, we do not want to reinvent the wheel, right? If a plugin already exists, we want to find it and use it. We do not want to code it ourselves. And when it comes to downloading plugins or finding the right one, we have to separate in two different categories, the commercial side of things and the free side of things that we all so love. On the commercial side, there's not much going on. I personally know of 3 companies that produce commercial plugins. So Foix, that would be us, one of them. We built this entire framework of 160, 170 plugins that all work together to do some pretty cool things. But we also have some pure Apex plugins. We've just released a file upload and image editor recently. There's also the folks at Apex R&D who are the people behind AOP and now AME, the Apex Media Extension. These are more of kind of like services, but you interact with those services via Apex plugins. I also know of another Apex Smart Pivot plugin. It basically brings some Excel-like functionality into Apex. if perhaps you're not fully satisfied with the interactive grid. That's on the commercial side. So you do have to pay money, you have to pay a subscription, and for those plugins, you get support, you can you get updates, you can request new features perhaps, so on and so forth. On the other side, we have the free plugins. There is a great hub or a collection of all the open source plugins over at apex.world. If you don't know apex.world, I highly encourage you to go and check it out. It is a great resource for beginners and experienced alike. But they have this section right here for plugins. And here you can see more than 200, I believe it's 230 open source plugins. That is crazy. So not only can we download and use them, we can even look at the source code. That is awesome. That being said, we have to be a bit realistic and realize that free things are not always perfect. And there's a lot of things that are not guaranteed when using free things from the internet. Support is not guaranteed, quality is not guaranteed, security is not guaranteed, and updates are not guaranteed. You might download a plugin, such as, I always like to give this example, the Drop Zone 2 plugin by Daniel Hochleitner. Just great plugin, right? Well written, supported for many years, good quality, there's always updates. You might need such a component and then you're lucky, right? But you might then find something else, you bring it in, but with the next version of Apex, doesn't work anymore. You look at the repository, there hasn't been an update in years, then you're unlucky. These are things that you have to keep in mind when importing open source plugins into your application. Also, yeah, quality can vary. So out of these 200 plugins, I would have to say that about, this is my experience, perhaps you've had different experiences, but only about 50, let's say, give or take of them, 50 are actually production ready, still working and good. The rest might have just been either bad from the start or just abandoned throughout the years, unfortunately. But that's just the way it is. And not to bash on the plugin developers, of course not. But I also probably have a plugin on there that's not maintained anymore. So just a thing to keep in mind. Let's talk a bit about the anatomy of a plugin. So what does a plugin actually consist of? Well, when you go in the builder and try to build one, you'll see all these different sections, which are basically name, internal name. Name is the thing that you will then see in the builder when instantiating your plugin. The internal name is sort of like a primary key. Then you have the type. We've discussed the 6 different types. So you have to pick a type. And then based on that type, you will have to provide some PL SQL code. And we will get to that. Usually a render function, you will have to provide what happens when the Apex engine has to get to our plugin. What should happen then? Then you have settings. These come as standard attributes and custom attributes. These are things that you can then set in the page designer as settings, right? The developer sets them and the plugin code interprets them and perhaps configures the plugin in a different way based on those settings. And a plugin can contain files, usually JavaScript and CSS. It can throw events, and it has some metadata like a version or URL. This doesn't impact at all the functionality and the help text either, but it's still good to include those things. Okay, let's talk a bit about those callback functions that I've just mentioned. If you're a beginner and you look at this, you think, what on earth is this? And I still sometimes think the same. In this case, these are the callback functions, the bare minimum that you need for a region type plugin. You will see we have a render function and an Ajax function. And let me quickly take you through the way Apex generates a page for you to see where these fit in. So let's say the user requests page 10 on application 100, and the Apex engine gets to work. It does authentication, authorization, a bunch of checks, and then it gets to page 10 and it puts the header and the title, and it sees an interactive grid. It knows how to do that because it's an internal component. It sees some form items. It knows how to handle those. And then it reaches your plugin, your region plugin. Well, that's not native to Apex, and it doesn't know what to do at that point, right? That's when it trusts that you have a render function declared. So it calls that render function with some parameters, in this case, p region and p plugin. These are the important ones. And then it trusts that your code will then paint perhaps the HTML onto the page via http.p or set up your environment. Then after your render function is done, it simply moves on to the next region in this case, and so on and so forth. That's why a render function is important. You'll also see Ajax functions. These are things that enable client-server communication via Ajax. So say your region type plugin is some report, and sometimes it should refresh. You would via JavaScript invoke a function that would basically be an Ajax call, and on the server, the endpoint where you end up is this Ajax function that you declared in your plugin. So then you can do whatever update to some process, and ultimately you would probably http.p back a JSON object saying, hey, everything was successful, I'm done here. So these are the two most commonly used or required callbacks, the render function and the Ajax function. And you will see that the signature for these functions always look slightly different based on the plugin type. So what we've just seen here are regions. But here we see that a dynamic action, the function declaration or signature looks slightly different. And you don't have to learn these by heart. There are lists out there, and I can show you a cool trick where you can, or a place where you can get boilerplate code from. But just keep in mind they look slightly different for every plugin type. Custom attributes, we've already said that your plugin can have attributes or settings. So in this case, we have the drop zone plugin, and it has some attributes, right? We know that we can make it work however we want for that particular instance, and that is done via attributes, which are declared as such. You would declare them in your plugin settings, and then the end user, which in this case would be a developer, would have access to them like this. You also have files. Perhaps your plugin uses some JavaScript library. That's a very common case scenario. You would then upload these files to your plugin. There is an upload file button in the plugin edit page. You upload them, and then you would probably have to reference them. Just because they are uploaded does not mean that they will be loaded onto the page. You must mention them here with this syntax under file URLs to load. Or perhaps you want to load them dynamically at render time. Based on some configuration, you want to upload some files or to include onto the page some files and not others. There is also an API for that you can call from PL SQL. But in most cases, 99% of plugins just have one JavaScript file, one CSS file, and they are declared here statically. Useful APIs. What are some things that help us build plugins? So here we have the PL SQL side of things and the JavaScript side of things, and with the PL SQL being the more commonly used one and the one that we have to use. JavaScript is only optional. So on the PL SQL side, you will have to work with Apex plugin and Apex plugin util. Those packages are, you cannot really get around that. But there's other things that help us, such as Apex escape when we draw or when we output HTML. Also Apex JSON, very important for this Ajax communication. On the JavaScript side, if you implement a item type plugin or a region type plugin and you want it to behave like the other native components, you will have to implement a so-called interface. It's basically just calling on the JavaScript side apex.item.create and do something over there, or apex.region.create and implement that interface as well. Also for Ajax communication, the apex.server namespace is the place where you'll have to look to actually start this Ajax call. So just a short list of useful APIs for plugin development. Security. Security for plugin development is not any different really from developing any APEX application. The two main, and I won't get into this in depth because I think Ronnie Weiss will be talking about this in less than half an hour, or in about half an hour in more depth. But the two main attack vectors, as always, are SQL injection and cross-site scripting. In the case of SQL injection, always use bind variables. Don't concatenate things together. And in the case of cross-site scripting, be careful what you output onto the page, right? So I have here a very short bad example. Depending where these L-height and L-content variables come from, they might contain some malicious HTML, maybe some script tags, right, that do something nasty on the page. In those cases, we want to make sure we escape all of those values before passing them on to http.p, and we do that via the escape package. But then again, I think Ronnie will get into this in the next session. Just some tips and tricks. Have some plugin boilerplate ready. I learned this way too late, but writing always this boilerplate code, you see those signatures, those function signatures all the time is not fun. Usually it's not straightforward because they are not all documented and so on. I would suggest that if you or your organization is serious about building plugins, you have some simple boilerplate plugins ready that you just copy and get going from there, that already have much of this boilerplate code ready to go. Or I will show you a little extension that helps you out with that a bit later on. See how other plugins were built, for example, on GitHub via apex.world. If you start developing plugins, you will inevitably hit some roadblocks one way or the other. And there's not a lot of documentation around plugins from what I can tell on the internet. So a great resource is just looking how other people did it. Go on apex.world, find a similar plugin to what you're trying to build, go to its GitHub page and see how that developer tackled that problem. It saved me more times than I can count. If you want to use a SQL Developer to write your PL SQL, if you're not happy with the built-in PL SQL editor inside of the builder, you can use SQL Developer and put your code in a package and then reference that package in the plugin settings. Keep in mind that this would require a database connection, right, to use SQL Developer. So if you are developing on an instance where you don't have access to that, for example, Apex Oracle COM, you cannot do this. Okay, let's move on to tools. Which tools are there to help us? And let's talk a bit about editing application or static files in Apex, because that is a bit of a pain, right? So let's say you have a lot of JavaScript, and in a regular Apex application, doing that, editing static files, although it's the suggested way of doing things to keep your JavaScript code in a file, updating that file and editing it natively is a pain. You have to download that file, change it locally, and re-upload it. In regular Apex development, people usually simply don't do that and put their JavaScript code somewhere on the page, right? There's some execute when page loads, there's that box right there, or you can put it in dynamic actions and so on. That's how we get around really putting our JavaScript code in files. For plugins, however, we have a bit of a problem because we don't have those dynamic actions. We have to put our JavaScript code and our CSS code in files. And editing those files, again, is a bit of a pain. That is why we have a couple of tools provided to us by the community. First and foremost, the very well-known Apex Nitro. If you haven't heard of it, it's a great tool. It is an open source command line tool. You will need Node.js to run it, and you will need a database connection to push your files to the server or to your Apex app. But if you have those things, what Apex Nitro allows you to do is edit your JavaScript files and CSS files locally, and via a command in the command line, you can push those files to your application or to your plugin, or however you configured it. It is a great tool. Again, open source on GitHub. I encourage you to go look at it. That being said, again, it requires Node.js, it requires a database connection, and it's not the most straightforward way of doing things. That is why, a bit of a shameless plug, but at FOEX, we created this browser extension, so much simpler to install, that allows you to do a bunch of things in the Apex builder. So where can we find this extension? On the Chrome Web Store and the Firefox extension store. It is the Apex Builder extension by FOSS. FOSS stands for FOEX Open Source. You can download it free and open source to use, and it does sort of what Apex Nitro does. It allows you to edit static files directly in the builder, and I'll show you just how in a minute. It also includes some special features for plugin development, and more are coming right now. So let me just demo this extension for you quick. So let's say you installed it. We see it right there. We go to our, it can do static application files, static workspace files, and plugin files as well. But let's just demo it here for static application files. You will see that it loads this new little region here, and we can already create a file, something which you can't do natively in Apex. Let's say Apex Connect script.js. Apex Connect, you see that our file was created and a code editor was instantiated over here. So we can say console.log, hello Apex Connect 2020. You can then save the file as well. It does a bunch of things. I don't have much time to get into it, but you can edit multiple files at once. So every file that is editable in a code editor, this plugin can take care of that. Edit side by side, minify, a bunch of things. So this works in this case for static application files, but it can help you for plugin development as well. So there's that. I'll show you the plugin specific features in a second. So again, Apex Builder extension by FOSS. Okay, these are the tools that help us when building plugins. How about a live demo? Because we had enough of talking. So I found a cool little JavaScript library on the internet, which basically renders this credit card preview right here. So based on some page items that I already have, you can just start typing something in, and you will you'll get a little preview. It is pretty cool. Just a little eye candy for your Apex application in case you have any credit card forms, right? Well, very responsive. And this is what it looks like in the page designer. So first of all, let's start from the beginning. Static application files again. This library requires these two files that I got from its respective GitHub page. So first I had to add those files in here, which are the prerequisites. Then I had to create, I already had some page items on the page, and I had to create this region with just an empty div. That's where we will render the thing. I also had to actually reference those files, right, under file URLs and JavaScript file URLs and CSS file URLs, and also instantiate this whole thing with a little bit of JavaScript code that, again, I found in its documentation. So I had some JavaScript code on page load. And it works, right? I have my little component here. But then again, it's kind of, and this is a good example, right? You're Other situations might be much more complicated. But I have here some HTML, I have this JavaScript file, this JavaScript code on the page, I have to reference those files, I have to upload those files. It would be nicer if we had all of this functionality packed in a plugin, right? So let's go ahead and do just that. I have a page 10 where I only have these items. So we start from scratch. There's nothing else besides this. And I always like working in this way to have one tab for the plugin development, one tab for the page designer, and one tab for the runtime. You can see I already finished it, but let's start from scratch. Let's create a new plugin. So the name of our plugin, let's pick something nice, such as something descriptive. Credit card preview. The internal name should also be a very unique thing, not just for your own instance, but for ideally worldwide, right? So I always like to do something like con.myname .card or something. This should be pretty unique. What type is our plugin? Well, because it doesn't hold a value and it's really just something visual, I will go with region. Go with region. And that should be enough for the beginning. Oh, by the way, I have a little cheat sheet here of how we can get that that move to a plugin. We have a few steps to take. Create the plugin, which we've already done. Include the required libraries. We'll do that. Create some plugin settings, and our plugin needs to generate some code, HTML and some JavaScript. These are the 4 steps that we need to go through. Okay, so we created our plugin. It should also include those library files, right, that we mentioned, because we don't want to reference them from static application files. We want it to be self-contained. So we see here upload file. Let me say I want them under lib. And these are the 2 files that I downloaded from GitHub. And we upload them. So just because we upload them does not mean that they will be part of the page on render. They must be mentioned here under file URLs. And I always forget this little syntax. So the way we mention them or we include them is by doing something like this. Okay, so our files are loaded as well. Let's return to page. Always check this checkbox and apply our changes. Now we can go onto our page. Always refresh the page to see your newly created plugins and plugin settings. And we should now see that under region type plugins, we should see our credit card preview right here. Let's instantiate it, give it a name, credit card preview. Okay, doesn't do anything. There are no settings. It's kind of boring. Let's try to run it. Oh no, there's an error. What does the error say? No render function has been defined. Well, it's good that it's telling us that because it doesn't know what to do with our plugin. The Apex engine reaches this step, it sees our plugin, and it has no idea what to do with it. So it calls our render function. You take care of it. You generate that HTML or whatever you have to do. But we haven't declared one. We haven't declared the render function. And again, you remember that weird looking code. Usually what people would do is click here and copy the, now this is for items. You would have to find what you need and copy this and format it to your coding standards, so on and so forth. That's not fun, which is why this little extension, the FOSS browser extension, adds a little link right here. It also adds these API references, but in this case, we're interested in this boilerplate code. So we would click on boilerplate code, and we would see a little pop-up appear where we can choose our plugin type. In this case, we're already on region, and we can choose the different callbacks. In this case, we only want the render function. And we have a bunch of code that we just copy we close this and we put it in here. This doesn't do much. It just declares the function. It does some debug. It outputs just an empty div onto the page and a little console log that gets executed on page load. Keep in mind, you don't just have to declare your function here. You also have to reference the name of that function over here. So we click and we put in render. Let's apply our settings, changes. And now we should see that when we refresh this page, it loaded. So something did happen. A render function was found and executed, but still it's kind of empty. It's just this this box that really was generated by the template, by the standard template. So if we say blank with attributes, and if we position it just in the center of the page, it should actually not be there because we only output an empty div, but it's a beginning, right? Let's quickly, what's our next step? Create the settings. As you've seen on page 1, our code is a bit, the reference to these page items happens right here in this piece of code. And everything is kind of hard-coded, so we cannot just put P1 and reference such items in our code directly because that's not going to work on other pages and so on. So I would say that these 4 are good candidates to be plugin settings or attributes. So I'm going to go down here and stick with me here because it's a bit of a repetitive work. Create 4 very similar attributes. So let's say number item. And I'm going to choose page item as the type for this attribute. And I'm going to do the same for name item. Again, page item required, create and create another. Expiry item required, oops. Create and create another. And one last one, page item required CVC item. Oops. Small mistake there. Let's add again our last setting, CVC item, page item, create. So now that we've created 4 settings, where do we actually see them? We go back to Page Designer, we refresh our page, and we see that our plugin here has some attributes. It has those attributes that we just defined. So let's go ahead and assign some actual values. Name, expiry, CVC, and I'm starting to run out of time. Let's save this, but we don't actually do anything yet with those settings in our code. So the last step, we already outputted some HTML, but we want to replicate a little bit of JavaScript that we saw on page 1. So I'm going to go ahead and cheat a little bit here and just copy this code. And I'll explain the little changes that happened there. Paste there, make sure it worked, and apply the changes. So what I just added was basically the interpretation of these items. So this parameter, p_region, contains some attributes, attribute 1, attribute 2, 3, and 4. These numbers correspond with these numbers right here. So the number item would be number 1. And then we save it under some variable for all of them. And down here, by using Apex JSON and Apex JavaScript, those APIs that I told you about, those packages, we can generate the same piece of code as on page 1 and execute it on page load. So this little piece of code is created like this and executed on page load. That is, if we now refresh our page, We have the HTML, the JavaScript instantiates it, and everything should just work. So our little plugin works. And in my opinion, this is a much cleaner way to go ahead about building such a component rather than having files all over the place and dynamic actions and all kinds of references, right? So just a simple region with a couple of settings. That's been it for the demo. Some closing words, some takeaways. Plugins in general, great for adding new functionality into your Apex applications. Also great for modularizing already existing functionality. Perhaps you want to clean things up or make everything more usable. Plugins are the way to go. When it comes to building plugins yourself, there is a learning curve. But from personal experience, I found that not only can you overcome that, but also you learn a lot about how Apex is built behind the scenes and its architecture by understanding how plugins work. So even if you don't need a plugin, right? I still suggest or recommend it as a learning exercise because there's lots of good things to learn from it. That's been it for me. Are there any questions?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Stefan. That was very informative. And I've got one question here, which says, if we have render and Ajax function in a database package, then things needs to be taken care for import and export of plugin.
Yes, so I think the question is how, if we write our code in packages, how do we ship that with the plugin, if I understand correctly? I think, and the answer would be you need an extra step. You cannot just export and import your plugin. You would also have to export and compile that package. Package comes first, then plugin. That's about it.
Okay, there's another one. Can a plugin be created to freeze column header result region in a faceted search in the new Apex?
Probably. I mean, I'm not sure about this particular requirement, but if it's doable with JavaScript, which most things are, a dynamic action with a little bit of JavaScript in there could probably achieve that.
Mm-hmm. And last one, any use cases for initialization plugins?
Initialization plugins. What are those?
I don't know, it doesn't say. Maybe.
Okay, I'm not quite sure about that, but for all of these 6 types of plugins, there are many use cases in general.
Okay, well, just maybe time will tell.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we're pretty much on time. There's one more question. Is it possible to create edit CSS files with the FOS extension?
Create and edit CSS files?
Create or edit CSS files.
Absolutely. So if do you still see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Good. So I've even demoed it just briefly. I already have this app icon CSS. I mean, you can create it, but you can just choose your file and you can say, I don't know, border radius 50%. And simply Control S or save will save your file. So that is an edited CSS file.
Okay. I think we should stop here so everyone can get
Awesome.
a cup of coffee and a piece of cake.
Sure.
Thanks very much. And